for the 14th seminar of E-Legal Festival Edition. The guest here with us today is Professor Dr. Yugan Goyal. He is an associate professor of economics. He received his joint doctorate from Erasmus University Rotterdam, University of Bologna, and University of Hamburg in 2016. Earlier, he majored in law and economics from the same universities and University of Manchester for his masters. For both his masters and PhD, he was the Anonymous Mundus Fellow. He has an engineering degree from National Institute of Technology, Surat in India. Yugank has taught in visiting capacity at IIM Ahmedabad, IIM Kozhikode, and has been the docent at the Harvard Law School's Institute for Global Law and Policy. He sits on the governing council of the Indian School of Public Policy. Presently, he is helping establish in setting up a rural school in Western UP. It's a privilege, sir, to have with you today. And the topic of discussion with you today is design of electoral system. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm quite happy and delighted to be here. As I hear many of the listeners will be law students, but I think I have kept my remarks rather general, so it will be useful for probably more than just law students. You see, I'm a faculty member at OP Jindal Global University, and of course I teach subjects related to economics. But a good part of my training has been in law as well. So law and economics is largely the intersection at which I usually do my research. And one of the primarily my work is my interests are largely in law and development, informality, institutional economics, regulation. But I also do fair bit of psephology. Psephology is very simply stated data or number analysis of elections. And with my colleague Arun Kaushik, we have been working on some of the, we have been trying to excavate a lot of data in Indian electoral politics. And we are coming across a range of very interesting findings, which I think has quite significant lessons for policy reforms. And it is that aspect of my research that I wanted to, bring forth in the conversation today with LPU, and hope that many of you as law students and even otherwise, you will take up some of these important policy, large-scale policy measures that are needed in this country, given the way our electoral systems are evolving and they're designed. In fact, of course, they were designed and they have been in place for a long time. But we have to recognize that with time, the designs of institutions often may not change, and the institutional impacts, institutional dynamics require these designs to change. So what I'm going to do is, if it's possible, I'll probably put up a slideshow, because a little bit of what I'm going to talk about will be best displayed on a graph, because I'm going to talk about some numbers and then some policy discussions. And I'll, of course, later on leave it for some conversations at the end, if possible. But let me quickly try and share the screen. Let me see. Okay, yeah. So I hope you are able to see my screen that I have on the window.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
It's visible. Wonderful. Okay. So you see, Google Ngram is a very interesting source to begin this conversation. So Google Ngram is a very useful tool, and I encourage you to look at it. It basically collects how frequent is a particular term in English, mostly it's English, occurs in all kinds of texts in the last 200 years, 220 years actually now, 210 years. And how, and its occurrence that Google has, amongst those which Google has digitized. And I tried picking up the term democracy and elections and see how frequently the word elections or the word democracy occurs in all kinds of written text all around, specifically in books. And look at what's happening. So there is a lot of interest. I mean, this is indeed a very crude but still a good proxy of how much a particular word or a term or an idea or concept is prevalent in a certain time. So we see the discussion on democracy was at its peak, just almost at the time when India was gaining its independence, right, mid 40s to late 40s. This is also the time when independence was gaining a lot of ground. The World War had ended. There are many other countries that were becoming independent. And this also has a spike right after 60s when many countries in in Africa secured their independence. There is a lot of, the spike is also seen in just before 1920 when the First World War was ending and the Russian Revolution was taking place. And interestingly, since the 90s, also this word has started becoming more and more powerful and prominent. You can think about it from the perspective of different kinds of civil wars that many countries, both in Eastern Europe as well as in Africa, were going through. But notice something interesting. Election as a terminology in the consciousness of people, so to speak, has consistently increased and has not really accompanied democracy along with, right? So people are talking about elections, but they have really begun talking about elections a lot after the 1960s, and that sentiment has continued to percolate. So while the idea of democracy has had its ups and downs and has been there for a long time and has been there a lot, the idea of elections is now gaining momentum at many levels. And it's important because what we want to do here is to see not about, so this conversation is not going to be about democracy. Of course, democracy can be part of it, but it becomes really complex if we bring it into this picture. But I want to have this conversation largely on electoral designs, so to speak. To explain what I'm talking about, I'm going to pick up two strands of thought. But before that, I'll just pick up the elections in India specifically, and there is just very little information that I have brought. I mean, there's a book that Arun and I are writing, and that book should be out at some point next year. But I've collected just two graphs, just to give you a sense of how important elections are now going to be over time. You see, the number of parties in India political parties has just increased hugely. And notice that the number of national parties has remained almost the same in the last 30 years. This is interesting. In fact, in the last 40 years. And this is interesting because we see the emergence of various kinds of political parties, but not national political parties, which means there is a lot of regional parties that are appearing on the scene. And 2019, you see the number of parties. So number of parties on the x-axis and number of national parties is on the right-hand side of x-axis. So there are two axes that you have to look at. So your bar graph corresponds to the x-axis, 100, 200, 300. So there are more than 650 parties, out of which national parties are only 7. This means there is an emergence of political consciousness in local spaces, in smaller areas, in smaller regions, and regional political parties are gaining prominence. This is not a very good metric of how, number of parties is not always a good metric because most parties are often meaningless. But what is more important is the effective number of parties, and that's really a mathematical index, which I have kept away from this conversation. But it still gives you an idea of the importance that elections hold in our country. This is another graph that shows the voter turnout. In fact, Bihar's first phase of election had very powerful turnout. It's expected to, Bihar's overall election are going to have a fairly good turnout despite the COVID, even though Bihar has one of the lowest turnouts in general amongst other states in the last 20, 30 years. But notice what's going on. So number of eligible voters is increasing, but that is purely number, absolute number. So it's increasing. The voter turnout has remained constant, but the voter turnout is in percentage, which means as we are increasing in our population, our number of voters are also increasing, but number of people who go out to vote remain almost at the same ratio or at the same share of the total number of people eligible to vote. And so this sort of gives you an impression of why and how elections are gaining prominence and more importance. In fact, I can tell you the reason why elections are becoming more important in India. That's one very interesting proxy is the amount of money spent by political parties, not by the Election Commission, on elections. And you should be aware that the Association for Democratic Reforms does some work, and there are some other organizations that collect this information because not all of it is openly available, but a vast amount, but a good. There is an overwhelming consensus that Indian electoral politics, the election years in India, Lok Sabha election years, the political parties spend as much, if not more, money than which is spent by which is spent in American presidential race. So this is a lot of money. I mean, our per capita income is very small compared to US, but our electoral expenses are as high as the US. This tells us something. This tells us that elections have a very have become a far more powerful tool for all kinds of things. Right now, with this backdrop, let us go a little bit deeper into understanding what are the issues. And frankly, I just want to bring about two issues, a third issue if there is time, but two issues are very important, which are now slowly becoming important in the eyes of many people. But for most part of our electoral history, we have not really looked at them very carefully. And it's the dynamics of the seat and the vote share. So let me try to explain this table to you first, so that you understand what the problem is, and then come back to some of the instances and examples in Indian context. So let's say I'm going to go slow, and I hope this is easy. You really don't need to be a mathematician to understand this. Let's say there are 3 constituencies, yeah, and there are 2 candidates. Constituency 1, candidate A secures 51. Let's say there are 100 voters in each of these 3 constituencies. Candidate A secures 51 votes in both constituency 1 and 2. Because candidate A is winning in the first and the second constituency and losing in the third, the winner of the election is candidate A. This is exactly how elections take place in India. This is called plurality system of voting, or in other words, first past the post system. So imagine a post, whoever passes the post first is the winner. And candidate A has won 2 out of 3 seats, and therefore candidate A forms power. But if you look at the number of votes that these guys have received, there's something which somewhat shocks you, which is to say that it is totally likely, it is very much possible that the victory margins for candidate A are very small, but the losing margin is huge. So candidate A is winning by 2 votes in both the constituencies where he's winning, but losing by 100 votes. So candidate A is securing overall 102 votes, and candidate B is securing overall 198 votes. And yet, candidate A, he or she is who makes the power, who forms the government, and who occupies the power. Now, this is interesting. If I were to ask you, how do we decide who should be forming the government, you would say a candidate who's liked by most people, or a party which is liked by most people. But clearly, as you can see in this table, this is very much a mathematical possibility, that people who win more votes end up not forming the power, not forming the government. Of all the constituencies in India, if we sum up all the total number of votes that go to BJP or Congress or any other party, we may realize that while the seats may have gone to one party in a huge number, the votes may not have. And just to illustrate this point, let me show you this graph. Okay, so this is basically the blue bar is showing you the seat share won by the winner. It's only for the winner, whoever won. And the orange bar is showing you the vote share. Now, generally, parties who have won more votes should win more seats. But notice what's happening in 1989 and also 2004 elections. 1989 is peculiar. It's amazing. Because here, the number of votes received by the winner were more than the number of votes received by the loser. Whereas on the other, and in 2004, yes, number of seats were higher. Not the number, the percentage of seats and percentage of votes. The percentage of seats was slightly higher, but the difference was very small in 2004. the seat share is calculated based on number of seats you win divided by the total number of seats that the elections was held on. And number of votes you get divided by the total number of votes that everyone got. And notice what's happening. Political parties that are forming power and forming the government in elections like in 1989, like in 2004, and even probably in many others, they are actually not really the winners, so to speak. Or if not winners, they're not necessarily winners who ought to be taking everything. But in electoral systems, what happens is whoever wins takes everything. So it is never divided proportionally. And this is something that I'll come to in a minute. This is this index of seat and vote share is quite powerful. Entry point into understanding, is there a leakage of the mandate? There are so many people who are voting, but because these voters are spread across all kinds of constituencies, therefore it's not collecting together. Their votes are not coming together. They're all distributed within various constituencies. Let me tell you something about 2014, because that was a very peculiar election where the dominating party BJP actually came to power with 31% votes. So they got 31% votes out of the total number of votes cast. What is 31% of those who have come to vote? That is 20% of eligible voters. 20% of eligible voters is 14% of total population. That is close to 17 crore. Okay, so 17 crore people out of 125 crore, which was the population of India, around 130, 125, between 125 and 130. It's funny, the population of India's error rate is sometimes larger than a regular country in Europe. The population of India was around 125, 130 crores. So 17 crore is the total number of people who voted for BJP. These are the guys who decided India's fate for the next 5 years. Number of people who voted for BJP, 17 crores. Number of people who did not vote for BJP, 55 crores. But because the way our system is designed, BJP, of course, gets to make the power, gets to form the power. In 2014, Congress secured 19% votes. BJP was 31%, Congress was 19.3%. BJP, of course, got huge number of seats, but Congress got merely 44 seats. In 2009, when BJP got 18% votes, almost the same as how much Congress got in 2014, Congress was winning in 44 seats, BJP was winning in 116 seats. More than double of what Congress. So in other words, what I'm saying is, let me repeat this perhaps for some of you, if I have been very fast here. In 2014, BJP gets 19% votes. 2014, Congress gets 19% votes, 44 seats. 2009, BJP gets same number of votes, but 116 seats. In 2014, Bahujan Samaj Party got 20% of votes in Uttar Pradesh. How many seats? 0. In Tamil Nadu, DMK, Dravid Munnetra Kazhagam, they got 27% votes. Number of seats? 0. In Orissa, Congress got 26% of the votes. Number of seats? 0. In Bengal, Left Front got 30% of the votes. Number of seats? Only 2. And so the seat share and vote share dynamics has begun to assume a lot of importance. Maybe let me switch on the lights. Perhaps it's dark. Okay. So there is something going on here with respect to seat and vote share. Let me show you something with respect to Bengal, and this is this is an example of how seat share and vote share indicate. I don't want to call it predict, but they indicate what might be lying under the numbers. So look at this graph carefully and see and notice a few things. You see the number of votes, vote share is explained using the gray line and the yellow line. Whereas the seat shares are indicated by the bars, the blue and the orange. Now, one bar corresponds to the winner. The orange bar corresponds to the runner-up. So as you can see clearly, whichever party won, they won because of the seats, obviously. But these guys are winning with considerable margin in terms of seats. There's high number of seats. For instance, if you look at 1987, CPM is winning with more than 60% of the seats, whereas the runners-up, the party which was trailing, the second party, is winning with merely 12 or 13% seats. But look at the differences in the vote share between the winner and the runner-up. The winner is gray line, the runner-up is yellow line. Okay, and you will notice something interesting. From 1982 until 2006, the vote share difference between the winner and the runner-up has been very small. In fact, in 1987 and in 1996, the loser, the runner-up, had higher number of votes, whereas the winner had lower number of votes, which basically means if anyone was observing this data during the 80s and 90s, they knew the CPM is forming power and they're sitting and enjoying this victory on a very thin margin of votes, even though very high margin of seats. And so it was not a surprise when Mamata Banerjee took control of the political party in 2011. And interestingly, both in 2011 and 2016, Mamata Banerjee's party has a very high share of votes alongside the share of seats. So the victory of CPM throughout the so-called communist era of West Bengal was actually not sitting. The victory was not hinged on a high volume of votes in their favor, but only seats. And I've just shown you, high number of votes does not necessarily mean high number of seats. In fact, it would be quite the opposite. And that is why this is important. In fact, to illustrate this point further, I also did one more graph. And I'm sorry about a little bit too much mathematics here, but this graph will probably be the last one in that sense. And here's an interesting one. We calculated what we call as average margin of superiority. Average margin of superiority is the margins with which a winning party is winning in the constituency it is winning. So for example, if a party is second, the runner-up party must have also won in some seats. Wherever it has won, what was the margin with which it was winning? That is winning. The green line, the first party, the yellow line, second party, and the green line is the third party. And quite clearly, interestingly, the victory of the winners was not so far away from the victory of the losers, wherever these three people were victorious. And so this forms some form, through this, I want to trigger this conversation or discourse and thought process on what is the impact of seat share and vote share dynamics in electoral politics. And these days, actually, this is becoming a very, very powerful and important indicator, because what's happening is that political parties are now getting to realize that effectively elections are a number game. Now, this may not be a very appreciable and an admirable step, because elections cannot be only about numbers. But practically speaking, at some level, they end up becoming only about numbers. And that is why when we celebrate the idea of democracy, we often forget that democracy is constitutional democracy, but democracy is also electoral democracy. And using the same democratic features, same electoral features that a democracy promises, often numbers could be rigged in favor of one party against the other. You can really take this calculation at a booth level and frankly do it. So anyway, this is part one. I will now come to part two, and I'll see if I can be quick on it. Here's an interesting one. Sorry about this. Just a second. Give me a second. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this light was shining on my face. So we have a plurality system of voting, first past the post system. So if you look at the first row, this one, which I have now colored, you can clearly see that the winner in this case is going to be the red color, 47. Even though 47 is a small proportion of the total number of votes. So for instance, if we have to vote for, let's say, the books, Hamlet, Da Vinci Code, Republic, and Emma, and let's say 3 people vote for Hamlet, of course, the book that will be read by everyone out of 10 people, out out of 8 people, only 37% of people wanted to read Hamlet. 62% people did not want to read Hamlet. And still, that was chosen because you're following a method of plurality. Now, in other words, therefore, what we are doing in our system of electoral design is that we are picking up, the winner is picked up based on who is liked most. But here's an alternative thought that I want to give you, which is, instead of looking at who is it who we like more, what if we look at those who we dislike the least? Interestingly and mathematically, they both will not lead to the same answer. Let me try to show you how. So what I'll do is, in the next slide, is that I will force these voters to give their preference order for the 4 books: Hamlet, Da Vinci Code, Republic, and Emma. So HDRE. How will you rate according to your preference order if I were to force you to rank it? Let's say the ranking has been exhibited as you see in this first table when my cursor is moving. So Hamlet was obviously, Hamlet was obviously selected by 3 people as the first preference. And so therefore you see these 3 blue circles. But now let's try to compare this with Da Vinci Code for a minute. Da Vinci Code was the first preference of only 2 people. And so therefore they will lose from Hamlet if a first past the post system is implemented. But notice what's happening. Hamlet is also hated, is the last choice, by 4 people out of 8. Look at these blue arrows here, the blue circles. 4 people absolutely hate Hamlet, and 1 person almost hates it as a third choice. And the other 3 love it. On the other hand, if you look at the red circle, the Da Vinci Code preferences, you observe something very interesting. Nobody really hates it. Yeah, 2 people love it. 2 people, in fact, 4 people are okay with it because it's a second choice. And 2 people are not so okay with it, but they don't hate it either. In other words, if I were to ask you, from looking at this preference order, which of these books, if read in the class of 8 people, will give least sadness rather than maximum happiness? You would probably pick up Da Vinci Code, isn't it? Because nobody hates it after all. So Da Vinci Code is a candidate who we all can agree with. It's okay. Because if we bring Hamlet into the picture, yeah, majority will be happy, but a vast minority. In fact, we shouldn't even call it majority because majority is above 50. So you should call it plurality. Yeah, plural. More number of people will be happy, which is 3, but a bigger number, look at this one. 62% people will be sad. And so, in other words, it is about sadness of the loser sometimes that we could be concerned with. And that is not part of our electoral design. That's not part of most electoral designs. I have just done a little bit of a calculation here. As you can clearly see in the second and the third table, I have removed the least, the worst choice, which had the fewest first choices. And I do this one after the other. And now I see that D, which is Da Vinci Code, is liked by 2, 3, 4, and 5 people, whereas Hamlet is liked by 3 people. And automatically D becomes a winner. This is called instant runoff voting method. And there are all kinds of voting methods. And I don't want this class to be on voting methods. But I hope you get the picture. Armed with these 2 ideas, voting method that focuses on focuses on how can we minimize the dislike of the winner compared to maximizing the like, and voting system where seat and vote shares are adequately organized in such a way, we come to 2 major policy constructions, which I'll quickly discuss today, maybe in the next 10-15 minutes. Presidential versus parliamentary and proportional representation. I think the first one does not require a lot of introductory from me. Presidential system is a system where president has all the powers, and then in a direct democracy, you can vote for the president directly. Whereas in a parliamentary system, you vote only for your district or your constituency's legislator, who will then, who's because member of a party, all these party members will elect the leader who will become the prime minister. And as you can clearly, recognize, India follows a parliamentary system of democracy. Now, there have been a lot of debates going on about which system is better, and do we need a presidential system where we can elect our leaders directly, or do we need a parliamentary one? And quite frankly, this debate is not new, because this was a heated debate even in the Constituent Assembly. And I will highly encourage all of you, in fact, regardless of whether you're lawyers or not, to read the Constituent Assembly debates and see the absolutely delightful depth of philosophy and a delightful depth of critical thinking that our parliamentarians had at that time. Sorry, the Constituent Assembly had at that time. And they were really debating on whether we should allow parliamentary system or a presidential system. Of course, the Constituent Assembly chose parliamentary system. You see, the parliamentary system comes with the benefit of responsibility. When Americans adopted the model back in the days when they were, when they gained the independence, 1776, they followed Montesquieu's model of separation of executive, judiciary, and legislature. And therefore, the executive, who's the president of the US, does not sit in the parliament over there in the Congress. Over here, the prime minister is part of the legislature. He or she sits in the parliament, which means that the distinction between executive and legislature is not so distinct in our system, in parliamentary system. The parliament is answerable to the parliament. The prime minister is answerable to the parliament. So the benefit is that the person becomes responsible to the party or to the parliament or to the legislatures. The problem is that this often comes at the cost of stability, because of course, if the party is out of power and if the party is not in majority, the head of the state also has to vacate. But interestingly, it was thought that in a scenario when you have a parliamentary system, you will also be able to have representations from all kinds of corners. The difficulty was that in a parliamentary system, prime minister becomes answerable to party politics, and often majoritarians will begin ruling. And this was the argument that Professor K.T. Shah in the Constituent Assembly made, that a parliamentary system becomes hostage to the party. And if the party works on majoritarian principles, then often minority rights could be trampled upon, which will not happen perhaps if the executive, there is a tendency of the executive in a presidential system to be dictatorial because you have a lot of power, but you are also more decisive. And so this was a decision that we took back in the days. And of course, I can go on and on about what kind of debates, went on. If I were to sort of really pick a few points from those debates, I think they are interesting. Even though there are all these positives and negatives, but there is a trade-off, and we simply chose to be in favor of the trade-off for responsibility rather than stability. These were Ambedkar's words, actually. He said the daily assessment of responsibility, which is not available under the American system, it is felt far more effective than the periodic assessment and far more necessary in a country like India. The draft constitution, in recommending the parliament system of executive, has preferred more responsibility to more stability, unquote. Now, and of course, there were many other conversations that went by. Professor K.T. Shah was of the opinion that the president should be in the position to command the confidence of the people, whether they're majority or minority. He should be a real representative and one elected to function as the head of the state and as its representative. I quote, "After all, your parliament is liable to be dissolved at any time. The local legislatures in the states may be dissolved. The president, on the other hand, will be elected for a definite period. As such, he will be outside the turmoil of party passions, will be outside the momentary ups and downs, the vicissitudes of parliamentary fortunes, and will be much more likely to maintain balance and to give degree of stability to our government, which it may not have under party passions." Unquote. These were very valuable conversations, and over a period of time, there is this Maurice Duverger, who was a French sociologist, who came up with this sort of so-called law called Duverger's law, in which he said that the parliamentary system will probably create a two-party system over time, because the small parties will all merge with the big parties, which is somewhat what we see in a way, even though not exactly, because our regional parties are quite strong, and in India, they have a very important role to play, because they reflect and they represent interests of all kinds of different minorities around the country. But Ambedkar was, without knowing, actually perhaps trying to recognize Duverger's law in principle, that a presidential system will have multi-party system. The Duverger's law is not really applicable to India, but there is a point there. The question that I want to leave you with, however, is that whether we are going through a time now that we want to rethink about these considerations. Obviously, you will need a constitutional amendment, and you can't change the basic structure of the constitution. And this will require a change in the basic structure of constitution. So I don't know whether it's possible or not, but the debate is on. Shashi Tharoor, for instance, by the way, is a vociferous defender of the presidential system, and so on and so forth. The second point, which is very quickly the proportional representation. Let me show you a graph. Again, I'll pick up an instance from the Vidhan Sabha elections of West Bengal in 1982. So forget about the colored portion, just look at the first 4 columns. The number of seats all the parties have won in 1982, number of votes, and the vote share. What is the vote share? Vote share, for instance, 0.6 is 129,994 divided by the total, 22,487,336. Okay, so that's the vote share. That's how you get the vote share. Now, so let's look at, for instance, Congress. Congress is a good party to look at for this in this table. Okay, Congress secured 35% votes. 35% votes, and they secured only 49 out of 294 seats. That's around 15%. So they have secured much less seats, but a lot more votes, right? This means that a lot more people in West Bengal wanted Congress to come to power, but simply because they were scattered everywhere, the number of seats that came to Congress was only 49. So 35% of votes came, but only 16% of seats came. So there is a shortfall. What is a shortfall? 56%. So Congress should have gotten, sorry, not 56%, 56. So Congress should have gotten 56 more seats. On the other hand, look at CPIM. CPIM had got almost the same amount of votes that Congress had, 38%, Congress was 35. But look at how many seats they've got. They've got 174 seats out of 294. Now that's a lot more than even half. It's almost, more than 60, 65% or so. In other words, CPI, only 40% people wanted, but they got more than, I think 70% or so votes, 60, 65% votes. So there is a surplus of 60% seats. So there is a surplus of seats that CPI has, and that surplus is here, 60. So CPI should have ideally secured 113 seats, because 113 is 38% of the total seats. And Congress should have secured 105 seats, because 105 is 35% of total seats, but they ended up securing only 49. So what is the shortfall? 105 minus 49, 56. What is surplus? 174 minus 113, that is 60. So there is this whole question of, there are people in the parliament who should have been represented more because more people voted for them, and there are people who should not have been represented as much because less people voted for them, but simply they ended up winning more seats, and that's why they're in the parliament. What this does is, this lets electoral politics run on the lines of constituencies rather than as a nation, rather than as a state, as a region, as a province, and therefore proportional representation tries to arrest this tendency. So what they'll do, they will actually increase or decrease the number of seats that you have in the parliament based on number of votes that you get. A very simple way to do it is to perhaps increase, let's say, the number of seats. Let's say, I'm again going to refer to the graph. So one way to do proportional representation, and there are many ways to do it, many countries do it as well, is to increase the number of seats for Congress, and to decrease the number of seats for CPI based on the number 60 and 56. So then you will ask me, how do you increase the number of seats? Well, you don't need to increase the number of seats, so to speak, but you can increase the weight of the vote that the person has who comes in the parliament from Congress party and decrease the weight of the vote that every candidate has who comes to the parliament from CPI or to the Vidhan Sabha. Alternatively, you can tell the party members that, look, we have, based on the vote, I'd go and tell CPIM, you can get 113 seats in the Vidhan Sabha. And I tell Congress, well, based on 35% votes, you will get 105 seats in Vidhan Sabha. And so therefore, Congress will now send 105 representatives, 49 of which have already won. The remaining, Congress will choose from its rosters. One way you can do it is that people themselves select candidates also. And so these 49 have won. What are the other places where people have selected most candidates? You bring those candidates up and put them in 105. CPIM is told that out of 174, we will only take 113 from you. And so you decide which ones should they be. Based on this, what we are essentially doing is we are creating the Vidhan Sabha of West Bengal, in this example, exactly how Vidhan Sabha should be like, which is not based on their individual constituencies, but based on how the entire state has voted for. This type of system is going to take a much longer time to come in because this is a little bit complex, and Ambedkar in the parliament, in the Constituent Assembly debates, was very clear that we don't want to do this largely because Indians are illiterate and they will get confused. But no longer as much, A. And B, we do a lot of proportional representation. We do these type of methods when we are selecting the members of the Rajya Sabha, when we are selecting the president, when we are selecting the governors, when we are selecting members of the Vidhan Parishads, the legislative councils, and so on and so forth. But this is I hope in some sense able to give you an idea as to why policy making and electoral reforms are important, particularly for lawyers also, to understand a little bit of mathematics behind elections. Because if you don't understand these numbers, then all we'll focus on is constitutional democracy. But a good part of this celebration of democracy is about elections. And let us not forget, elections at the end of the day are about numbers. And if our numbers are telling us something, we want to listen to it. Many countries in the world have begun listening to it. Political parties have started listening to it. We only want a time when you and I, as voters, will also listen to it carefully. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you for the time. I want to stop here. And if there are some questions, I'm happy to pick them up.
Yes, sir.
Please tell me.
Yes, sir. There is a question posted on LPU YouTube by Saksham Prajapat. He says that, sir, as we talk about election, it's a huge and expensive activity. Surely, if that money is applied on public welfare, we can see the change. Sir, what will you suggest? Can we build a system, maybe digital, which can be less expensive and less complex?
So, first of all, I don't think we should assume that digital elections are going to be cheaper. If you include all the costs, including the cost of streaming. But there is also always a risk of digital elections in terms of tampering with the IT system. In fact, I must tell you, globally, and I've lived in Europe for a long time, people still vote on a ballot paper. They don't vote on an electronic machine. And in fact, the first time when electronic machines were used was in Kerala in the 1980s, at some point earlier. And the elections were challenged in the court because the one who was supposed to be the winner, I mean, I can give you the details another time, or maybe I can find it. He felt that these elections are not displaying the right results, and Supreme Court had to. I wonder if it was Kerala High Court or Supreme Court, but they had to reverse the decision. They had to ask the constituency to go for a paper voting, in which the guy who was winning the election in electronic voting actually lost. So, in other words, there is this thing about there is this element of skepticism about using electronic mechanisms for voting. But what I would say is that in order to arrest these tendencies, India is doing much better. I mean, we are still using electronic voting machine. So if you were to ask my own personal opinion, the way we transfer cash online through our phones, I think there should not be any major skepticism towards creating an online fashion of voting. This way, at least many people who are staying far away from their home constituencies are also going to be voting. And that, I think, probably is something that we may see in time to come.
Indeed, sir. Sir, there is another question posted by Sakshi Jain. She asked that, sir, should voting should be made compulsory, as only few peoples or few percentage of people are still doing the votings.
That's a very good question, Sakshi. And I, frankly, my view on this should not matter. I think this is a question that we all should ask each other. If voting must be made compulsory. So there are proposals that if you don't vote, then you will not be eligible for many state support programs, and so on and so forth. But practically, I think there is the problem here is not about people not wanting to go to vote. The problem is often about convenience. And it is not fair to say that you should be willing to take or accept some inconvenience if you want to elect a leader. I mean, this is not some sort of a voluntary contract that we have signed. It's an involuntary universal contract that we have come with. And I have a feeling, if I can club the two questions, if voting is allowed online, and if India has a very extensive online penetration, internet penetration, then there is a case of making it mandatory. But otherwise, we have to be sympathetic towards the cause of millions and millions of people who are not able to vote simply because they are incapacitated for all kinds of reasons. I mean, if I am staying in a different city and I am unable to go to my constituency, then it is rather unfair to impose electoral obligation on me. Look at what happened when we announced the lockdown. You know, many migrants had to go back to their homes in all kinds of situations. And so, in my view, things could be only made compulsory if there is an element of, and I don't even want to use convenience or comfort here, but if there is an access, if the access is possible, or if access could be made, then perhaps making it compulsory could make sense. And so it is nothing to do with, in my view, your electoral obligation that you have. And sometimes many of these things can be discussed at the level of political ethics, but that would be for another day. And yeah.
Indeed, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Lastly, I would like to ask you, which improvements in the Indian electoral system would you suggest?
Well, so maybe one of them has been already mentioned, which is about creating enabling infrastructure for people to go out and vote. Now, if you were to ask me, I mean, this is a long, I don't know how long have you got for this answer, but I can quickly tell you. I personally think proportional representation captures the sentiments of what we want to capture in electoral constitutions better. Countries around the world have experimented, and proportional representation, in my view, has yielded much less leaked result, so to speak. The other thing I would say is we must have a very, very strong mechanism to channelize how the campaign money is spent. To me personally, a vast amount of resources spent in election is duplication. This is one of those classic cases of patent races. Everybody will put in money, but one person will win. So all the money that was spent by the loser and all the losers has all gone because the system is about winner takes all. In a winner takes all system, a classic auction, for instance, auction of an oil field, when I tell you that patent, all kinds of companies are rushing to find the disease, the solution or the drug for the disease, but only one of them gets the patent. This, by the way, is not happening in COVID because all these companies are doing a lot of things in a very integrated manner. The whole world is united in a very different way, which is not the case here. And so that's another one. In fact, I was hoping that Bihar elections will probably provide or attempt to provide a model, because election commission has restricted campaigning, big campaignings. I mean, still going on a little bit here and there, but not in the same way as it usually happens. And so people are now able to get their minds at work and really think in a very unalloyed, in an uninfluenced fashion who they want to vote based on what happened in the last 5 years, report card of the incumbent government. And these guys are, a lot of money that we spend on electoral campaigning is actually a deadweight loss. I mean, deadweight law is not the correct term to explain it, but you know what I'm saying, is often a sunk cost, actually, right? And this amount of this campaign expenditure is really where I think a vast number of reforms must take place. Another thing is about, and this is something interesting, I think Indian parliaments and generally the state legislatures as well is a very unique, very unique place, and it's a unique place because it has, some of the largest number of criminals in an organization, people who have criminal records. But more importantly, Indian Lok Sabha is richer than India, by more than 1,400 times. I mean, in 2019 Lok Sabha, the total assets of all the candidates in 2019 Lok Sabha is more than 27,000 crores. So this Lok Sabha is 1,400 times richer than its people. In fact, the per capita income of India is only 10,000, monthly, approximately. In 2014, 82% of our Lok Sabha members were crorepati's. And so in some sense, also Indian Lok Sabha has an average age, one of the highest average ages. So if you look at the difference between average age of the population and average age of its representatives, the difference is one of the starkest in the world in India. They're the oldest representatives in the Lok Sabha. And these things often tell us about whether they are representing us, and whether someone who does not come from the type of socio-political experience and background that the vast majority of the country actually lives in, is that an ideal and adequate representation at all to begin with. And in that sense, again, this is connected to the campaign finance question that I had. And this, I think, would be the second one. And of course, the third one is parliamentary versus presidential. And we really need to think if we must be able to separate our executive from the legislature and allow the executive to take decisions which are not influenced by party politics and really in the interest of people. And this way, people will be able to vote for the elector really directly. If I can answer this question in this way.
Thank you so much, sir. That's all for the question. Lastly, I would like to mention this session was organized by Student Organization Democrats under the aegis of Division of Student Welfare, Lovely Professional University. We thank you, sir, for joining with us today, and it was a valuable session provided by you, and we all are honored from this session, and it was a whole knowledgeable capsule for all of us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. It was a delight to be here, and I'm sorry if I was a little fast or a little too much of numbers, but I hope some of you at least found it useful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir.